My name is Emma Harris. I hold the rank of Major General in the United States Army. That's not something I usually lead with, but today, it matters. Because for most of my life, especially to my own family, I wasn't Emma the daughter, Emma the sister, or even Emma the person. I was just inconvenient. A complication in their polished lives. Funny how a set of medals on your chest can still fail to earn you a seat at your own family's table. Right now, I'm sitting in a sunlit corner of a tiny cafe in Naples, Italy. The air smells like fresh pastries and roasted espresso, sweet and bitter all at once. My uniform jacket is draped across the chair beside me, crisp and heavy with decorations that strangers here nod at respectfully. To them, I'm someone to admire. To my family back in Savannah, Georgia? I was always just the problem child. The too loud, too driven daughter who made everyone else look smaller by comparison, without ever trying. I've been deployed more times than I can count. I've spent holidays crouched behind blast walls, birthday dinners traded for MREs under foreign skies. You'd think after all that, the last place I'd feel truly under fire would be in my mother's living room. But that's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes family knows exactly where to aim. They thought I wouldn't come. When the wedding invitation arrived, neat script on ivory cardstock, I must have flipped it over in my hands 100 times. It sat there on my metal desk like a dare. At the bottom, right under the RSVP line, in my sister Chloe's familiar swirl of letters, she'd written, "Please behave." Can you believe that? Not "we miss you" or "hope you'll come." Just that tight-lipped warning, like I was a grenade waiting to roll in and blow up her big day. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you felt the sting of your own blood treating you like a liability. If so, you'll understand why I couldn't just toss that envelope in the trash. I needed to see them again. Not for hugs. Not for some tearful reunion. I needed them to see me. Because sometimes, showing up is its own kind of victory. A part of me, the younger part, the one that used to braid Chloe's hair on the porch steps, hoped I was wrong. That maybe, just maybe, this was a fragile olive branch. But I've learned the hard way that hope is like glass. Looks pretty, shatters easy. Outside the cafe window, a Vespa zipped by, the rider shouting something cheerful in Italian. A street vendor was setting up a stand of bright oranges and sunflowers, their colors almost too vivid to be real. The normalcy of it made the ache in my chest feel sharper. Because my normal doesn't look like this. My normal is sand and sweat and dust in my mouth, or a sterile briefing room with satellite images glowing cold on a screen. Not Sunday markets and old men arguing over football scores. I took a sip of my coffee. It was strong enough to make my teeth hum. I wondered if my mother had even told her friends I was invited. Margaret Harris, retired school principal, loved hosting garden parties, loved showing off her perfect daughter Chloe. The pretty one. The gentle one. The one who never ruffled anyone's feathers. Me? I was always the girl in combat boots tracking mud through her polished hallways. You know, I used to think blood was everything. That no matter what, family would pull you back, hold you close, brag about you even when you didn't ask for it. But that's not how it worked for me. Turns out, the people who share your last name can still look right through you. Or worse, rewrite you into something that makes them more comfortable. I pulled my phone from my pocket, thumbed through my emails, half expecting something from command that would give me an out. An urgent briefing, a sudden transfer. Anything. Nothing. The only new message was a short note from Sergeant Miller back on base. "Ma'am, if you go to stand tall. Not to fold." Miller. Short. Unsentimental. Exactly what I needed. The waitress stopped by my table, dropping off a fresh pastry I didn't order. Her smile was bright, a little uncertain, like she didn't know if it was okay to linger. I thanked her. Watched her walk away. Then caught my reflection in the cafe's front window. My hair pulled back into a regulation bun, faint lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before Kandahar. My posture still straight even off duty. That posture saved my life more times than I can count, but it also builds walls even when I don't mean to. I sat there a long moment, tapping my fingers against the ceramic cup. Wondering. Was this trip about confronting them? Or proving something to myself? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. But here's what I do know. The wedding is in 4 days, down in Charleston. Chloe's marrying a man named Daniel Scott. A man I once dragged bleeding through Afghan dirt with bullets cracking so close I could feel the air split. A man who once promised me he'd never forget what I did for him. And now he's linking arms with a sister who spent years pretending I didn't exist. If that isn't life's twisted sense of humor, I don't know what is. I finished my coffee, left a few euros on the table, and stood. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. Turns out, there are worse things than bullets. Like walking back into the crosshairs of your own family. So tell me. If you were me, would you go? Would you stand in the middle of people who only ever learned to love the version of you that stayed small? Or would you stay far away, let them keep their illusions, and build a new life somewhere they could never touch? Drop it in the comments. Hit like if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family's story. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened when I finally showed up at that wedding. Trust me, you're going to want to see the look on their faces. Because sometimes, revenge doesn't need fists or fury. Sometimes, all it takes is showing up. And letting the truth stand there, unmovable. When I think back on my childhood, I don't picture anything dramatic. No screaming matches, no plates shattering against walls. If anything, my memories are so quiet they almost hum. Our house on Montgomery Lane in Savannah had a wraparound porch, painted seafoam green. My mother loved to hang baskets of petunias there, tiny purple explosions that bobbed whenever a breeze rolled in off the coast. Inside, everything was meticulously arranged. Picture frames lined the hallway, carefully dusted, each one capturing our family in polite moments. Easter brunch. Chloe's ballet recitals. My graduation from high school, though if you look closely, you'll notice mine is smaller, tucked near the end of the hallway, half hidden behind a lamp. My mother, Margaret, swore it wasn't intentional. But you and I both know sometimes it's what people don't say that reveals the most. Chloe was the golden child, no question. 2 years younger, with sandy blonde hair that curled into perfect little waves around her face. Even her laugh was musical, like something out of a summer afternoon. I adored her once. I'd tie her shoelaces, help her practice spelling words. She'd trail after me through the backyard, tiny feet kicking up little storms of pollen. At night, we'd sit on the floor of her bedroom and build blanket forts, whispering about things we'd do when we grew up. I think back on those nights a lot. I try to remember if there was ever a point when the ground shifted between us, when sisterhood turned into silent competition. But maybe that's just life. Some distances open so gradually, you only notice when there's a canyon between you. Margaret was always proud of how pretty Chloe was. She'd take her shopping for pastel cardigans and delicate necklaces, fuss over her hair before church. I remember one Sunday, standing by the door in my sensible navy dress, hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. My mother gave me a once-over, sighed, then turned back to Chloe and pinned a tiny crystal clip into her curls. Like that sparkle might catch the pastor's eye and earn her an extra blessing. Isn't it strange, how we keep score even when we pretend we're not playing? I used to tell myself I didn't care. That I was tougher, that Margaret's approval was a flimsy thing I didn't need. But deep down, I still noticed the way her smile never quite reached me the way it did Chloe. I still caught the sighs when I chose cleats over ballet slippers, ROTC camp over cheer practice. You ever look back and wonder if maybe you spent your entire youth chasing after someone else's idea of who you should be? I think that's why the army made sense to me. It was brutally clear. You passed or you failed. You stood your ground or you didn't. No subtle digs, no delicate silences that cut deeper than any outright insult. But childhood wasn't all cold. There were Saturday mornings when Dad would make buttermilk pancakes, humming off-key to old Willie Nelson songs. The kitchen would smell like syrup and burnt edges, and Chloe and I would fight over who got the first stack. Sometimes, after mowing the lawn, he'd collapse onto the couch with sweat darkening the collar of his t-shirt, reach for the TV remote, and pull me into his side like it was the most natural thing in the world. I clung to those moments. I still do. Because the truth is, for all the pretty snapshots on those hallway walls, it was Dad who made the house feel like home. When he passed, lung cancer that clawed through him so fast none of us could catch our breath, it was like the floor vanished beneath us. Margaret held tighter to Chloe, as if that one bright spot could keep her steady. Me? I just kept moving. It felt safer than standing still long enough to notice how the air had changed. I was already in my first tour by then, stationed out of Baumholder, Germany, prepping to deploy to Kandahar. I flew home for the funeral in my Class A's, the green wool that never sat quite right on my shoulders. It itched at the collar, made me sweat under the Georgia sun. But it was the only way I knew to honor Dad, who used to wear his own dress blues with a kind of quiet pride. The service was small, a modest gathering at St. Andrew's. I walked up the steps alone. When I reached the front pew, Margaret glanced up at me, eyes rimmed red, then looked back down without a word. Chloe was there too, gripping our mother's hand. Neither made room. I stood through the entire service. Later, outside by the cemetery gate, Margaret laid a hand on my sleeve. Not my hand. My sleeve. Like she couldn't bear actual contact. "You didn't have to come in uniform," she whispered, voice tight. "It makes it seem like you're trying to overshadow the family." I didn't answer. What would have been the point? Her eyes darted away as quickly as they met mine, and I turned back toward the gravesite, feeling something small and bright inside me flicker out. Funny how that moment stays sharper than any firefight I've been in since. It's almost embarrassing, right? That bullets didn't get to me, but my mother's disappointment did. And that's why, all these years later, when Chloe's wedding invitation showed up with that little "please behave" scrawled across the bottom, it wasn't just a summons to her big day. It was a reminder of every quiet way my family had ever told me I didn't quite fit. Every small adjustment of posture. Every polite redirect. Every instance where my successes were too loud, my presence too pointed. But here's where the story begins to change. Because even though part of me was tempted to toss that envelope and keep living my carefully constructed life half a world away, something else stirred. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was old, festering grief. Maybe it was just me finally deciding that if I was going to be seen as the problem, I might as well show up and be undeniable. So, I booked that flight to Charleston. And I promised myself one thing. I wasn't coming home to ask for space on that porch swing. I was coming to claim the seat at the table they always hoped I'd decline. When I try to explain my mother to people, I always get stuck somewhere between two pictures. There's the Margaret Harris who taught third grade for nearly 30 years, who kept a dish of peppermints by her classroom door and wrote cheerful notes on kids' report cards in purple ink. Then there's the Margaret who would stand at our hallway mirror for 20 minutes, adjusting her pearl earrings, checking her lipstick, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her blouse. As if perfection was a requirement, not a preference. It was the same at home. Everything in our house had its exact place. The couch cushions were always fluffed, the dinner plates matched down to the faint gold rim, and even the throw blankets were folded into neat squares on the armchairs. The only wild thing allowed was the hydrangea bushes out front, and even they were trimmed religiously every spring. Margaret believed beauty needed control. Chloe fit into that world like a hand slipping into a silk glove. From the time she was small, she seemed born to be someone's favorite. She'd twirl in our living room in little sundresses with tiny embroidered flowers, giggling when Mom clapped. By the time she was 12, she had a collection of delicate jewelry boxes lined with crushed velvet, all filled with dainty gold chains and birthstone rings. I remember watching her brush her hair at night, 100 strokes exactly, just like Mom taught her, until her blonde waves caught the lamplight and practically glowed. Meanwhile, I was the kid who came home with grass stains on my jeans, scabs on my knees, and half my hair pulled into a crooked ponytail. I liked to climb the old pecan tree in the backyard, to see how far I could get before the branches started to bend. Sometimes I think Mom didn't know what to do with me. It wasn't that she disliked me. She just seemed puzzled. Like I was a riddle she couldn't quite work out. She tried to mold me, in gentle ways at first. She'd buy me pale yellow blouses with little bows at the collar, even though she knew I'd tug at them all day. She'd sign me up for etiquette lessons the summer after 7th grade, where Mrs. Longmire taught us how to cross our ankles and sip sweet tea like we were already debutantes. Chloe took to it instantly. I lasted 3 sessions before I begged off, telling Mom I'd rather mow the neighbor's yard for spending money. Sometimes at night, I'd hear them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, warm, threaded with that easy affection that always made my chest ache. Margaret would praise Chloe's delicate handwriting, her careful manners, the way she smiled at guests. They built a rhythm together that I could never quite step into. I'd lie in bed, listening, half hoping someone would say my name. They rarely did. Do you know that feeling? Being in a house full of people who all speak the same language, while your words tumble out in a dialect no one wants to learn? It's lonelier than silence. As we got older, the distance grew. Chloe blossomed into the kind of woman who made small talk look like an art form. She'd lean in when she laughed, touch someone's arm lightly, tilt her head just so. Men noticed. Margaret would beam, watching her. Meanwhile, I was off at basic training by 19, my hair cropped short, my shoulders getting broader from endless push-ups. The first time I came home in uniform, Margaret's eyes skimmed over my ribbons and rested instead on my boots, caked in travel dust. "It's nice you're doing something structured," she said finally, her smile small and tight. That was the closest she ever got to saying she was proud. Then came Dad's funeral, that day that split our lives clean down the middle. Chloe wore a navy dress with tiny pearl buttons and clutched Margaret's hand like a lifeline. I stood nearby in my dress greens, hat under my arm, waiting for someone to gesture me over. Neither did. When the final hymn started, I stayed rooted at the aisle, blinking so hard I thought my eyes might burn straight through. Afterward, Margaret approached me outside, her fingers pinching the hem of her black sleeve. Her voice was low enough that Chloe, lingering by the church steps, couldn't hear. "You really should have worn something simpler, Emma. People were here to mourn your father, not salute you." I remember the way her eyes darted across the parking lot, checking to see who might be watching us. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't come out raw and jagged. So I just stood there until she turned away. From then on, I stopped expecting invitations. Holidays came and went. Margaret would send Chloe's engagement photos in stiff envelopes that smelled faintly of lavender, always with a small note scribbled at the bottom. "Hope you're keeping well." Never more than that. I'd pin them to the fridge on base out of habit, then toss them after a week. Some nights overseas, lying on a narrow cot with the whir of an old ceiling fan overhead, I'd close my eyes and try to remember what Chloe's voice sounded like. Sometimes it felt like all that survived was the melody, none of the words. Other times, it was sharper than ever, the way she'd call my name with that teasing lilt when she wanted me to hand over the last cookie. The way she'd lean against my shoulder at the fair, cotton candy in her hand, saying, "Don't let go, Em." Isn't it cruel, how memory decides what to keep? How it can replay one gentle moment 1,000 times, even when the years that follow bury it under cold distance? That's what made her wedding invitation sting so badly. It wasn't just the paper and ink. It was everything underneath it. It was Margaret's perfect cursive. It was Chloe's "please behave." It was the echo of a childhood where I'd once belonged, now twisted into a stage where I'd always be an awkward extra. But deep down, I think that's why I bought the ticket. Why I packed my uniform even though I knew it'd startle them. Because after years of trying to shrink myself to fit their comfort, I finally wanted them to see the whole of me, rank, scars, and all. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see what would happen when I walked through that door uninvited by their silent expectations. Would it break them? Or would it finally set me free? I was back on base in Naples when the envelope arrived. It showed up on a rainy Thursday afternoon, tucked between a stack of official memos and a requisition form for replacement generators. I remember because the windows were streaked with water, and my office smelled faintly of wet concrete and burnt espresso from the pot Sergeant Miller insisted on making, no matter how terrible it tasted. I nearly tossed the envelope aside without opening it. It was heavy stock, cream-colored, the kind that seemed to whisper about fancy dinners and family obligations. My name was printed across the front in neat, swirling script. No rank. Just Emma Harris, like I was still the barefoot kid chasing lizards across the yard in Savannah. That small omission felt bigger than it should have. I ran my thumb over the lettering, smudging it slightly, then flipped it over. Margaret's handwriting jumped out at me immediately on the back flap. She had this elegant, looping style she never lost from her years teaching cursive. Underneath the flap was a tiny flourish, a heart drawn so lightly I almost missed it. Part of me wanted to laugh. My mother couldn't pick up the phone to call me, couldn't send a birthday card that didn't read like a quarterly update, but she could draw a heart on an envelope as if that erased 6 years of silence. When I finally tore it open, the invitation slid out with a polite rustle. A sprig of dried lavender fell onto my desk, scattering tiny purple flakes across an old file about troop rotations in Cyprus. I stared at it longer than I should have. Chloe must have chosen that detail. Lavender had always been her scent. In high school, she'd dab it behind her ears, said it made her feel calm. Once, when I was 12, I tried wearing it too, hoping maybe it would make me softer, easier, more like the daughter Margaret wanted. It just gave me a headache. The card itself was beautiful. Heavy, textured paper with gold lettering, the kind of invitation that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. It was addressed to Miss Emma Harris and guest, a formality that felt oddly cruel, given everyone in that house knew I didn't bring anyone home. The words blurred for a second, then sharpened again. It was real. Chloe was getting married. In Charleston. A garden ceremony followed by dinner at some restored antebellum mansion. Margaret would be thrilled with that, all the chandeliers and manicured hedges. The bride-to-be line read Chloe and Harris in elegant script. Right beneath it was the groom's name. Daniel Scott. The air went thin around me. I set the invitation down like it was suddenly hot. My hand hovered over it, then curled into a fist. Of all the people. Of every possible man in the world, Chloe had chosen the one person whose life was tangled irrevocably with mine. Daniel wasn't just some old flame. He was the medic who'd pulled shrapnel from my shoulder in Kandahar, the same man I dragged out of a crater with his leg torn open and blood soaking through 3 tourniquets. We'd spent hours in the dust together, breaths shallow, waiting for a helicopter that might not come. I still carried a faint scar on my collarbone from that day. I wondered if he did too. It was almost funny. Almost. This was the moment in someone else's story where they'd say fate worked in mysterious ways. But standing there in my gray office, surrounded by military paperwork and the low buzz of the ceiling fan, it didn't feel like fate. It felt like someone had taken a dull knife and pressed it right under my ribs, slow and deliberate. I picked up the card again. Near the bottom, under the RSVP details, in Chloe's handwriting, were 2 words that made me exhale sharply. Please behave. Can you believe that? After years of silence, after not bothering to check if I was even still alive through 3 deployments, that was what she wrote. Not I've missed you. Not I hope you'll come. Just a delicate warning wrapped in fancy stationery. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the cracked plaster on the ceiling. My mind played tricks on me, trying to remember the last time Chloe and I had spoken in person. It might have been Dad's funeral. She'd clung to Margaret's side like a shadow, offered me a stiff little smile outside the church, then vanished into a sea of relatives. We'd never had the screaming match people expect from estranged sisters. Our distance was always polite, surgical. Maybe that was why it cut so deep. A knock sounded at my office door. Sergeant Miller stuck his head in, his cap tucked under one arm, eyes sharp as ever. Mail drop complete, ma'am. You good? I must have looked off because he took a step closer, squinting slightly. It's nothing, I lied. Then after a beat, I corrected myself. Family stuff. Miller raised an eyebrow. Understood. Just say the word if you need an extraction from a southern wedding. I've got a team that could pass for distant cousins. It made me huff out a laugh despite everything. Leave it to Miller to cut through my spiral with deadpan humor. As he left, I looked back down at the card. I thought about Chloe in her white dress, Margaret fussing with the train, guests sipping sweet tea under strings of fairy lights. I pictured them laughing, toasting, living out their perfect little tableau without me, or worse, with me off in a corner like an awkward footnote. Was that what please behave meant? Smile for the cameras, nod at the right moments, then slip away unnoticed? Maybe once, I'd have done just that. I'd have swallowed my resentment, shown up in a polite dress, and faded into the background for their sake. But not anymore. I ran a finger over the raised gold print one last time. Then I picked up my phone, pulled up the airline app, and started looking at flights to Charleston. Because whatever happened next, I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of an empty chair where I should have been. The day before I left for Charleston, I found myself standing in front of my narrow wardrobe, fingers skimming over the neat line of uniforms. The air in my quarters still held the faint smell of boot polish and lavender detergent, a weird mix that felt more like home than anything else these days. My dress blues hung toward the back, stiff and formal, the medals on the breast pocket catching the afternoon light in tiny flashes. It had been years since I'd worn that uniform for something that wasn't a memorial. Funny how it felt almost ceremonial just pulling it off the hanger. I laid it flat across my bed, smoothing a wrinkle from the sleeve. My hands paused over the silver eagle pins on my shoulders. I wondered if Margaret or Chloe even knew what they stood for. Or if they cared. Outside my window, the courtyard buzzed with the low thump of helicopter blades, soldiers hauling crates, a couple of junior officers joking near the mess hall. Life here was predictable in its own brutal way. You gave orders, you followed them, you kept your boots clean and your gun cleaner. It didn't matter whose kid you were or what sort of awkward seat you held at Thanksgiving. Out there, rank spoke louder than bloodlines. I packed light. A single duffel, the same faded green canvas that had followed me through 4 deployments. It carried scars of its own, little tears sewn up with black thread, sand that never quite shook loose. At the last minute, I tucked a pair of low heels into the side pocket, just in case. Not because I thought I'd need them, but because some stubborn, half-broken part of me still imagined Margaret might notice and nod approvingly. Old habits die hard. Sergeant Miller knocked twice before opening my door. He never waited for an answer, which I'd come to appreciate. There was no small talk with him, no awkward attempts to circle delicate subjects. Just blunt truths served up with the faintest curve of a smile. "You really going through with this, ma'am?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. His arms were folded across his chest, a mug of that burnt tar he called coffee steaming between his hands. I shrugged, tried for casual. Someone's got to make sure they don't screw up the seating chart too badly. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "You want me to line up a soft exfil? Just say the word. We could have you back here before the first toast." There was a comfort in that offer. In knowing someone was willing to pull me out, no questions asked, no family gossip to complicate it. I gave him a small smile. "Appreciate it, Miller. But I think this is one storm I need to stand in myself." He didn't argue. Just studied me a moment longer, then set his mug down and snapped off a crisp salute. "Fair enough, ma'am. If it gets ugly, give him hell. You're overdue." After he left, I sank onto the edge of the bed. My hands rested on my knees, thumbs rubbing small circles into the fabric of my pants. It struck me then how odd it was that a war zone had never rattled me the way my mother's dining room still could. A place with fresh bread on the table and linen napkins somehow held more danger than any checkpoint in Mosul. Isn't it strange, how the people who claim to love you most are the ones whose approval you keep chasing, even when you swear you're done caring? I'd earned every stripe on my shoulder, every line in my file through sweat and grit and choices that sometimes haunted me at 3 in the morning. But one little handwritten "please behave" from Chloe still managed to make my chest tighten. When evening came, I slipped out to the small cafe just beyond the south gate. It was a dim, cozy spot with battered wooden tables and an old radio that played scratchy Sinatra tunes. The barista didn't know my name, but he knew my order, a strong espresso with a splash of steamed milk. I liked that. It felt simple, free of the heavy history my family always dragged behind them like some ancestral wedding train. I settled into a corner table, the espresso warm between my palms, and watched locals drift by outside. A man in a navy peacoat walked hand in hand with a girl carrying a basket of oranges. 2 teenagers zipped past on bikes, laughter bright and unburdened. For a heartbeat, I wondered what my life might have looked like if I'd stayed that soft, Savannah girl. If I hadn't chased something harder, sharper, halfway around the world. Then again, maybe I was never meant to be soft. Maybe I came into this world with my edges already set. And trying to sand them down for my mother's sake was always doomed to fail. My phone buzzed on the table. A notification from the airline, reminding me to check in. Flight 708 to Charleston, departing 0540. I stared at the screen a moment longer, then confirmed my seat. Window, row 12. I wanted the distance. I wanted to see the clouds open up below me, to watch the ground become tiny and harmless. That night, back in my room, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet thrum of the ceiling fan, counting the rotations until my thoughts blurred together. I thought about Chloe's wedding dress, probably ivory satin, delicate lace along the sleeves. I thought about Margaret fussing over the flowers, adjusting a bouquet until it was perfect in her hands. I pictured myself standing there in the middle of it all, painfully out of place, yet somehow exactly where I needed to be. Right before dawn, I swung my feet out of bed and stood, stretching until my back popped. I looked at the uniform draped over the chair. Tomorrow, that uniform would walk back into a world that had long ago decided it didn't want all of me, only the parts that could be hidden neatly behind a polite smile. And for the first time, I felt something close to relief. Because this time I wasn't going to shrink to fit. I'd show up exactly as I was. Medals, scars, steel spine, and all. That was their choice to wrestle with. Not mine. By the time I pulled into the gravel drive of Margaret's house in Savannah, the sky had already dipped into that dusky blue that makes porch lights seem brighter than they really are. Her front yard looked exactly the same. Manicured hedges, stone walkway lined with terracotta pots bursting with marigolds. Not a leaf out of place. It struck me then how hard she worked to keep nature contained, clipped back to something manageable. Maybe she wished people came with pruning shears too. Inside, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary floated through the foyer. The dining room was already alive with chatter, forks clinking against china, ice cubes knocking together in tall glasses of sweet tea. Margaret's voice drifted out, smooth and lilting, talking about guest lists and centerpieces as if those things were matters of national security. When I stepped into the doorway, the room didn't exactly fall silent. It was more like a subtle ripple, a shift in air pressure, eyes darting up and then quickly away. A couple of cousins I hadn't seen since I was 12 offered tight, polite smiles. Chloe stood at the far end of the table, her hair twisted into an elegant low bun, tiny pearl earrings catching the chandelier light. She looked stunning, which wasn't surprising. Chloe had always known how to arrange herself to be admired. Margaret appeared beside her, cheeks flushed from the kitchen heat. Her blouse was a soft pink, the sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. She gave me a once-over, eyes moving from the tailored slacks and simple navy blouse I'd chosen, down to my polished flats. I'd debated wearing the uniform but decided against it. I didn't want them to dismiss my presence as just another extension of duty. This was personal. "Well, Emma," she said finally, brushing her palms down her sides. "You made good time." I almost laughed. That was Margaret's way of acknowledging an 8-hour flight, 2 layovers, and a restless night at a nearby motel. Just a casual nod to a daughter who hadn't stood in this house for over 6 years. Traffic was kind to me, I said. She pursed her lips, then turned back to the table, tapping Chloe lightly on the shoulder. Chloe glanced my way, lips curving into something that could have passed for warmth if you didn't know better. But I did. You'll be at the end near the sideboard, Margaret called over her shoulder. Plenty of space there, and easy for you to get up if you need to, stretch. Stretch. Sure. Or disappear quietly so no one would have to shift their seating plan. The seat waiting for me was half tucked beneath the table, a little off to the side so that the main conversation would happen comfortably out of reach. The napkin was a different pattern too, tiny navy checks while everyone else had crisp white linen. Probably a coincidence. Or maybe not. I've learned not to assume things were ever truly accidental in this house. As I sat, the old wooden chair gave a soft groan. Chloe laughed lightly at something one of her bridesmaids said, then looked over, her eyes sparkling with the same playful cruelty she'd perfected as a teenager. You look rested, she offered, voice sweet but empty. Deployment rotations will do that to you, I said, matching her tone. No wedding drama to worry about. She blinked, a tiny stiffening of her shoulders that told me I'd landed a hit. Across the table, an uncle I barely recognized cleared his throat and started talking about golf scores. Margaret leaned in to guide the conversation away from me like she was shepherding a fragile flock. Dinner passed in a blur of soft rolls, green beans sautéed with garlic, polite laughter that never quite reached my end of the table. I listened to stories about local charity galas, new boutique openings in Charleston, and Chloe's bachelorette weekend that apparently involved spa treatments and a sunset yacht tour. My life felt galaxies away from theirs. I tried to imagine explaining what Kandahar smelled like at dawn, or the way a helicopter rotor sounded when it was your only ticket out of hell. There was no space for that here. Maybe there never had been. At one point, Margaret stood to refill the wine glasses. She hovered by my shoulder, bottle poised, then tilted it just enough to give me a half pour. As she moved on, her hand grazed my back, more a nudge than a touch. Try not to overdo it tonight, she murmured. It's important for Chloe that everything feels seamless. Seamless. Like I was a snag in an otherwise perfect tapestry. I almost wanted to apologize just for existing. Almost. Isn't it strange how easily old roles slip back over your shoulders? I've commanded hundreds, orchestrated logistics that could make or break missions, but one gentle sigh from Margaret still managed to make me feel 14 again, clumsy and in the way. Dessert was served, a peach cobbler that Margaret had probably practiced a dozen times to get just right. The conversation swelled around Chloe, all eyes drawn to her as she described the flower arrangements, the string quartet. Margaret beamed, her hand resting lightly on Chloe's wrist, her body tilted toward her youngest like a sunflower to the sun. I watched it all from my place near the sideboard, spoon idly stirring the melting scoop of vanilla atop my cobbler. Some part of me wanted to stand up and knock over a glass, make them look at me, really see me, if only for a heartbeat. But I stayed seated. Because that's what I'd always done. Until tomorrow. Because tomorrow was the wedding. And whether they liked it or not, I wasn't planning to fade quietly into the edges anymore. I was there. Flesh, bone, hard-earned metals that weighed more than any of Margaret's expectations. And they were going to have to figure out what to do with me. The ballroom was bathed in soft amber light that made everything look more expensive, from the gilt-edged plates to the crystal glasses trembling on slender stems. Someone had chosen ivory roses for every table, each arrangement perched in a shallow bowl of water, petals barely touching the surface. They smelled faintly sweet, cloying even. Chloe loved roses. I arrived just after the last of the family photos had wrapped up. Margaret was still fussing with Chloe's veil, patting it into place like a nervous tick. Chloe stood in the center of it all, her satin gown pooling elegantly around her ankles, hair swept into a sleek knot at the nape of her neck. She was luminous. And she knew it. When her eyes caught mine across the room, her smile turned just a shade sharper. The maitre d' guided me to my seat, table 14, tucked behind a potted ficus near the caterer's entrance. Close enough to smell the lemon garlic shrimp being plated, far enough that the string quartet's gentle strains seemed to skip right over my head. My name card rested alone. Emma Harris, no rank, no +1. Just me, exactly how they preferred it. I draped my navy shawl over the chair and sat, smoothing the front of my slate gray dress. It was simple, understated. The kind of thing Margaret couldn't accuse of trying too hard. Still, I caught her glancing over once or twice, mouth pressed into that small line she reserved for things that needed correcting. Dinner passed in measured courses, each plate more carefully arranged than the last. Forks clinked, small bursts of laughter floated up, and from somewhere at the main table, Chloe's voice rang out like a silver bell. I watched her press her cheek to Daniel's shoulder. His hand rested lightly over hers. The image should have been tender, but something in it felt practiced, almost brittle. Isn't it funny how easily people believe in illusions? They'll toast to them, spend small fortunes to preserve them, wrap them up in tulle and candlelight. But the truth always waits. Patient. I sipped my wine and let the sweetness settle on my tongue. When the plates were cleared, Margaret rose, glass in hand, calling for attention. Her smile beamed across the crowd, radiant, controlled. She gave a soft little speech about Chloe's grace and light, about Daniel's steady devotion, peppering it with gentle jokes that made the guests chuckle in polite unison. I sat perfectly still, fingers laced in my lap. Then Chloe stood. She accepted the mic from Margaret with a delicate nod, the skirt of her dress swishing around her legs as she turned to face the room. Her eyes shone, though whether from tears or the chandelier's glitter, I couldn't say. I just want to thank everyone for being here, she began, voice bright, so effortlessly warm that half the room leaned in without realizing it. It means the world to us that you'd travel all this way to celebrate our beginning. A chorus of here rose. Chloe smiled wider. Then her gaze found me. And of course, even my big sister made it tonight. All the way from wherever she's stationed these days, guarding who knows what important doors. A small ripple of laughter ran through the guests, light and uncertain. Chloe tilted her head, lips curving into something almost tender. Truly, she added, voice dipping just a touch lower, it's a gift to have you here, Emma. Keeping watch over us, like always. That landed harder. The laughter that followed was fuller, more sure of itself. People laughed because Chloe had made it safe to do so, her gentle mocking wrapped in enough sugar to slide right down. My cheeks felt suddenly hot. I took another sip of wine, then set the glass down before it rattled against the table. Margaret didn't look at me. She was too busy beaming up at Chloe, eyes moist with maternal pride. I've survived mortars and roadside bombs, seen men twice my size crumble under the weight of less. But nothing compares to being dismantled by your own family in a ballroom full of strangers who mistake cruelty for humor. Across the room, Daniel shifted. His hand dropped from Chloe's waist, fingers curling at his side. For the briefest second, he looked like he might step forward. Then Chloe's laugh rang out again, delicate and pretty, and he stayed rooted in place. I wanted to stand, to walk straight out of that overdecorated hall, past the rose arrangements and clinking glasses, to never look back. But something inside me, call it stubborn pride, call it the last scrap of defiance from a girl who once scraped her knees climbing backyard fences, wouldn't budge. So I stayed seated. I lifted my chin just enough that the overhead lights caught the tiny bar pins on my dress, the subtle nod to my service. I met Chloe's eyes directly, gave her the smallest, calmest smile I could manage. She blinked. Just once. Like maybe she'd expected me to laugh along, to share the joke. I didn't give her that satisfaction. I held her gaze until she finally turned away. The guests began murmuring again, cutlery resumed its gentle percussion, and Chloe drifted back into the warm orbit of well-wishers. But something fragile had cracked around the edges. I could see it in the slight tremor of her hand when she passed the microphone back to the DJ. As dessert arrived, small plates of lemon tart topped with sugared berries, I let out a slow breath. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for all along. Not to be welcomed, not to be forgiven, but simply to endure without shrinking. To let them see I could stand in the very heart of their curated world, uninvited by their affections, and still exist on my own terms. Because sometimes, surviving the story they wrote for you is the quietest form of rebellion there is. And this night wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. I thought the night had already shown its sharpest edges. I was wrong. Dinner plates had long been cleared, replaced by half-empty coffee cups and delicate stemmed glasses catching stray flickers of candlelight. Somewhere near the dance floor, the band was easing through a lazy saxophone melody, the kind that smoothed out awkward silences and made even strangers sway in time. I tried to focus on that. On the music. On the warm, cinnamon-heavy scent of the wedding cake waiting to be cut. Anything but the hollow ache in my chest. Margaret was a few tables away, head bent close to a neighbor's ear, whispering something that made the woman's eyes dart discreetly toward me. Chloe was on her third circle of the room, accepting compliments with a gracious tilt of her shoulders, her hand always lightly gripping Daniel's arm as if to remind the world, or maybe just herself, that he belonged to her now. Funny how I could still pick out Daniel's posture from across a crowded hall. Even in a tailored suit, he carried himself like a soldier trying to look relaxed. Back straight, jaw set, one thumb hooked in his pocket in a way that always meant he was holding something back. The last time I'd seen him stand like that, we were crouched behind a burned-out truck chassis in Kandahar, waiting for the sun to give us enough cover to move. Do you ever wonder how many versions of a person exist all at once? Who they are with you, who they are with someone else, who they pretend to be when no one's watching. Sometimes I think the biggest betrayals aren't about what people do, but about realizing the part of them you knew was only ever yours. The DJ gave a short announcement, something about gathering for toasts. A few glasses were tapped with forks. Chloe's laugh rang out, bright and eager, carrying all the way back to my corner. I braced for another round of carefully crafted pleasantries. Instead, the microphone was handed to an older cousin, who launched into a rambling story about Chloe's college days, drawing out warm chuckles from the crowd. That should have been it. But when he finished and the applause faded, Daniel took a step forward. The mic ended up in his hand almost by accident, passed to him with an encouraging clap on the back. He didn't smile. Didn't even glance at Chloe. Instead, he looked straight across the tables, over bouquets of ivory roses and gold-rimmed glassware, and found me. For half a breath, I thought maybe he'd pivot, default to safe ground. Offer up something charming about how beautiful his bride looked, how grateful he was to the Harris family. But Daniel just stood there, thumb still in his pocket, shoulder square. And then, with an almost imperceptible breath, he pulled his hand free and brought it to his temple in a clean, deliberate salute. A murmur rippled through the guests. The kind of soft confusion that comes when something shifts suddenly out of the expected script. He held the salute until my own breath caught. Then, in a voice that carried perfectly through the stunned quiet, he said, "Major General Emma Harris. Thank you, ma'am, for coming tonight. Please forgive my wife." There was a collective intake of air, like the room had decided to breathe all at once. Heads turned. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Margaret stiffened so sharply she nearly upset her water goblet. Chloe's hand fell from his arm as if it had forgotten how to hold on. And me? I didn't move. Couldn't. I felt every pair of eyes swing in my direction, but I kept my gaze on Daniel. There was something raw in his expression, something that made my throat tighten. He wasn't doing this to embarrass Chloe. He was doing it to honor me. To repay a debt that went far beyond blood or marriage vows. Isn't it strange how the truth can stand up in a room and rearrange all the furniture of your understanding? A moment earlier, I'd been just the awkward sister tucked behind the ficus. Now, people were shifting to get a clearer look. Whispers snaked through the tables. I could almost hear them recalibrating. Major General. Not just Emma. Not just the odd Harris daughter who ran off to play soldier. The weight of those words settled over the polished hardwood floor and made it creak in places I was sure it never had before. Daniel lowered his hand slowly. His eyes didn't leave mine. For a flash, I remembered the dust and gunfire, the way his blood had soaked my sleeve as I dragged him to safety. How he'd gasped, "I owe you my life," into the grit of my shoulder. I guess tonight was how he chose to make good on that promise. Across the room, Chloe's face had gone pale. Her mouth worked once, twice, but nothing came out. Margaret recovered first, leaning in to say something sharp, something that tried to knit the evening back together, but it was too late. The spell was broken. Or maybe, finally, it was cast. The band had gone silent. A champagne flute somewhere clinked as someone set it down too hard. I could feel the collective discomfort rolling off people in waves. Not because I demanded it. Because for the first time, they saw the whole picture. And it didn't match the neat little story they'd written. I didn't rise, didn't give a grateful nod or play along with the social niceties that might have let everyone off the hook. I simply sat there, back straight, letting the truth settle where it wanted. Because sometimes, the loudest power isn't in the words you speak. It's in the quiet you refuse to fill. I sat there long after Daniel dropped his salute, after the buzz of conversation picked up again in awkward fits and starts. The band eventually stumbled back into a jazz standard, notes floating brittle through the hall. Waiters resumed their practiced dance, weaving between tables with trays of delicate pastries that seemed laughably fragile compared to the storm that had just passed. No one looked at me quite the same. I noticed it in their eyes, the way they now flicked toward my shoulders, like they were trying to imagine the weight of the rank they'd just been forced to acknowledge. Maybe they were remembering every polite slight, every little dig they'd let pass about the wild Harris girl who ran off to dodge real life. Maybe not. Either way, the room had changed. And I had done nothing but sit still. Funny, isn't it, how standing your ground sometimes requires nothing more than staying seated? I let my hands rest loosely in my lap, tracing the inside of my thumb with the pad of my index finger. That was something I picked up in the service, a quiet habit to keep my mind anchored when adrenaline surged. Out there, it had kept me calm through IED sweeps, tense negotiations and dusty outposts where a single misread glance could tip everything. Here, it helped me breathe through my family's uneasy recalibration. Across the hall, Margaret was speaking to one of her old friends, her voice too bright, almost brittle. Her hand fluttered at her throat, the pearl necklace shifting like it wanted to slide away. Chloe stood a pace behind her, posture slack, her smile wavering every few seconds before she remembered to adjust it again. I wondered if either of them understood yet that something fundamental had tilted, that the small universe they'd so carefully curated had a new gravitational center, and it wasn't them anymore. Is it cruel that I found a quiet satisfaction in that? Maybe. But I've learned that surviving 1,000 small dismissals leaves you hungry for even the subtlest acknowledgments that you were never who they decided you were. That maybe you were always bigger than the cramped box they kept trying to fold you into. I glanced down at my water glass, traced a droplet down its slick surface. My reflection shimmered faintly in the ripple, not quite solid. That was okay. I didn't need solidity right now. I just needed truth. And truth had finally stood up in this room, wearing Daniel Scott's unsteady salute like a banner. I thought back to Kandahar, to that day we huddled behind the broken remains of a market stall. The air thick with grit, distant pops of rifle fire echoing against sun-bleached walls. I remembered how Daniel's hands trembled when he first realized he was bleeding out, how he squeezed my wrist so tight I thought he'd crack bone. "Don't let me die out here, Emma," he'd rasped, breath hot with panic. And I hadn't. I'd dragged him through 300 yards of open street, ignoring the burn in my shoulder where shrapnel bit deep, ignoring the terror that clawed at the edges of my vision. I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because that's what you do when someone puts their life in your hands. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret or Chloe ever truly grasped what that meant. If they could comprehend what it felt like to be trusted in a way that was absolute, life or death without the soft cushioning of pretense. Maybe that was always the real divide between us. I didn't live in half-truths or careful illusions. I lived in decisions that left scars you could map with your fingertips. I glanced up just in time to catch Daniel watching me. His face was a study in regret and relief, a quiet apology threaded through gratitude he probably didn't have words for. He gave me the smallest nod, barely more than a breath of movement. I inclined my head in return. We didn't need more. Some debts were paid without ceremony. Meanwhile, Chloe had drifted closer to a group of guests, clutching her champagne flute like a lifeline. Her laugh was too loud now, sharp around the edges. Margaret touched her arm, murmured something that made Chloe give a tight little nod, her shoulders squaring again as if preparing for battle. I almost pitied them both. Almost. Isn't it wild how we spend our lives chasing the approval of people who are terrified of seeing us whole? I used to think love was unconditional, that blood tied us with unbreakable knots. Turns out, sometimes blood is just a messy contract you didn't agree to, and family is whoever stands with you when the bullets, literal or otherwise, start flying. A server passed by with a tray of tiny chocolate tarts. I took one, more out of reflex than hunger. It was delicate, glossy, dusted with gold flakes. I bit into it and tasted nothing. Maybe that was the final commentary on this entire evening, a room bursting with carefully staged sweetness that dissolved into air the moment you tried to hold on to it. I pushed back from the table, letting the chair scrape quietly against the floor. For a moment, the motion caught Margaret's eye. Her lips parted, a question rising there, but she said nothing. Chloe didn't look at me at all. They were both still trying to stitch the narrative back together, to patch over the raw seam Daniel had ripped open. I almost wished them luck. Almost. Because deep down, I knew no speech, no polite distraction could sew this back the way it was. And maybe that was the mercy in it. You can only live inside a pretty lie so long before the walls start cracking. I adjusted the hem of my dress, squared my shoulders, and took one last look at the glittering hall. All the roses, the crystal, the elegant illusions arranged so carefully around my family's chosen story. Then I walked toward the veranda doors, breathing in the warm night air that waited just beyond the polished confines. Because the next chapter, the real chapter, wouldn't be written under chandeliers or by anyone else's hand. It was mine, and I was finally ready to pick up the pen. By the time I wheeled my single piece of luggage through the sliding glass doors at Savannah's regional airport, my body felt heavier than it had during any deployment. The past 48 hours had been a swirl of forced smiles, stiff hugs, and that moment in the ballroom which had left my pulse drumming even long after I crawled beneath crisp hotel sheets. The airport was small, almost charming in its scale. Its white tile floor still gleamed from the early morning cruise buffing, the little coffee kiosk near the security line hawking buttery croissants and cinnamon-spiced lattes. A family stood nearby in matching polos, all beaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, snapping selfies in front of a banner welcoming home a college grad. Their laughter carried like a gentle echo. I paused for just a breath to watch them, letting myself imagine, however briefly, what it would feel like to be someone's easy joy. I tucked my duffel higher on my shoulder and made my way toward the gate. It was there, right at the edge of the terminal near a row of gray vinyl seats, that I felt my phone buzz. Twice. Then 3 more times. Notifications flooded in before I could even unlock the screen. Local news outlets. Then 2 I recognized from national networks. Each one with some version of the same headline. Major General Emma Harris's wedding disruption. Sister's big day overshadowed by military salute. Family feud goes public. I actually let out a tiny laugh. It sounded strange even to my own ears, like a note plucked on an out-of-tune guitar. Was this really where it had all led? Not dusty roads in Kandahar or tense strategy briefings in Brussels, but a gossipy headline about a family drama that barely scratched the surface of anything real. Then the cameras found me. I noticed the first reporter by her shoes. Bright coral flats, scuffed at the toe. Her breath caught when she realized it was actually me standing there in line for security, boarding pass in hand. A second later, her camera guy wheeled around, adjusting his rig with jerky precision. Then there were more. They came from behind pillars, out from the tiny newsstand, as if the floor itself had cracked and let them seep up. General Harris, can we get a quick statement about the wedding? Were you expecting your brother-in-law's salute? Is it true your family didn't invite you formally? Questions piled on top of each other, voices tripping over one another. I felt the familiar clamp of adrenaline in my ribs, like right before a briefing with brass that would decide where troops landed next month. Only this time there were no war maps. Just strangers hungry for sound bites. Part of me wanted to keep walking. To let my boots click across the polished floor until I reached the calm anonymity of seat 14A, where I could watch clouds drift below and pretend none of this ever happened. But then I caught sight of a young woman, maybe 20, lingering near the back of the small crowd. She was wearing jeans, a loose plaid shirt, and had her phone gripped so tight her knuckles were pale. Her eyes were shiny, wide, like she wasn't sure if she should be excited or horrified. And it hit me that whatever story got told here wouldn't just be about me. It would become a shape someone else measured themselves against. Maybe someone who'd stood in a kitchen like mine, nodding politely while pieces of themselves quietly shriveled up. So I stopped. I set my bag down by my feet and stepped over to a low metal podium that someone had abandoned near the car rental counter, draped with outdated tourism brochures. It would work. I rested my hands lightly on either side, grounding myself. "I know what you're here for," I said, letting my voice carry just enough to calm the sudden shuffle of feet. "You're hoping for a scandal. A broken family to headline your evening segment." Cameras blinked back at me. The Coral Flats reporter looked almost apologetic, pen trembling over her notepad. What happened at that wedding wasn't about embarrassment. It was about truth. For a long time, my family chose silence, and maybe I did too. We thought ignoring things would make them go away. But ignoring doesn't heal anything. It just lets hurt fester in dark corners. I paused, eyes drifting for a second to the overhead signs directing people to baggage claim. Life went on, even as mine seemed to pause here in this awkward little circle. Someone asked me last night if I regretted showing up. If I wished I'd let my family keep their version of events neat and unchallenged. I've carried men off battlefields, held them while they bled, made promises I was terrified I couldn't keep. None of that shook me like standing in my mother's living room again, trying to be small enough to fit her expectations. A woman near the edge of the group pressed a hand to her mouth. I wondered what memories I'd just stirred loose in her. I kept my tone steady. But today, I'm not hiding. I've started a fund called Valor Reclaimed. It's for servicemen and women whose careers have been quietly undermined by people who should have had their backs, family, spouses, even close friends. Because sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from war. They come from home. Someone's phone went off, playing a tinny pop song before it was quickly silenced. I waited, feeling the silence after grow dense. "This isn't revenge," I finished softly. "It's visibility. And if even one person out there needed to hear it's okay to stand their ground, in or out of uniform, then all those years of biting my tongue weren't wasted." For a moment, no one said anything. Then the young woman in plaid lifted her phone, eyes meeting mine, and mouthed a quiet thank you. That was enough. More than enough. I picked up my bag again, rolling it behind me towards security, leaving their cameras, questions, and hungry scribbles in my wake. My flight was boarding soon. And the life waiting for me on the other side didn't require anyone's permission to begin. A month later, I found myself standing behind a sleek wooden podium in a government hall in D.C., staring out at a room that was far colder and sharper than any battlefield I'd ever set foot on. The place smelled like polished marble and too many colognes mingling awkwardly, and the overhead lights had that sterile glare that made everyone's skin look a little washed out. Rows of dignitaries, aides, and a smattering of reporters sat in neat lines, their tablets and yellow legal pads poised for bullet points they could spin into headlines. A few high-ranking officers were sprinkled throughout the front, uniforms immaculate, medals shining so brightly they almost looked new. I wondered what stories hid behind those perfect lines of ribbons. What secrets never made it into official citations. A small microphone crackled as I adjusted it. My throat felt dry, and for a brief second, I almost longed for the dust of Kandahar, for the simple clarity of knowing exactly who the enemy was. Here, it was all quiet power plays, subtle head tilts, and questions designed to test whether I'd flinch. But I didn't. I drew in a breath, let it settle low in my chest, and began. Years ago, I sat across from a young sergeant in a dim barracks rec room overseas. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee. He'd just found out that his wife back home had emptied their accounts, sent an anonymous complaint to his CO claiming he was unstable. All to get sole custody of their daughter. I paused, letting the memory breathe. Even now, I could see that kid's gray eyes, wide and stunned, trying to make sense of how family, the one thing he thought would always be safe, had turned on him. He wasn't unique. In fact, stories like his are more common than most people want to admit. The people we trust most to keep our backs off the battlefield can sometimes be the very ones who sabotage us most completely. A murmur moved through the room, a ripple of discomfort that made a few notepads shift. I went on. For too long, our military protocols have treated betrayal by spouses or family as personal tragedies, not operational threats. Careers stall. Promotions vanish without explanation. Troops end up fighting battles in courtrooms or family kitchens that leave wounds deeper than any shrapnel. I let my hands rest lightly on the podium, careful not to grip it too tightly. I wanted them to see me steady. That's why we're introducing the Guardian framework. It's a three-pronged policy: immediate legal support, mental health care, and career shielding for any service member targeted by personal sabotage. No more letting these cases slip into silence because they're awkward or family matters. Silence is exactly how we lose good people. I've lived it. Many of you have too, whether you'll admit it in this room or not. I could feel them watching me differently now. Some faces still guarded, but a few, a general in the third row, a civilian staffer near the aisle, looked like they'd just exhaled for the first time in years. Isn't it strange how long we all keep our private griefs tucked away, believing we're alone in them? I used to think strength meant never admitting how deep a cut went. Now I know real strength is standing there with the wound still visible and saying, I survived. And I won't let the next person face it alone. A younger lieutenant leaned over to whisper something to the colonel beside him, nodding toward me. I didn't mind. Let them talk. Let them wrestle with what it meant that someone like me, a woman, a sister, a daughter who had been written out of her own family's narrative, was standing there rewriting policy. I closed my remarks with a slow, deliberate breath. We train our soldiers to handle enemy fire, to operate complex machinery, to survive in every hostile environment imaginable. It's time we also give them the tools to survive the betrayal that sometimes comes wearing familiar faces. Because betrayal doesn't just break hearts. It breaks units. It breaks missions. And we're done pretending otherwise. Silence settled over the hall. A complete, heavy kind of silence, not awkward but solid. I didn't rush to fill it. I let it press in, let them feel the gravity of what was changing. Then the Secretary of Defense, seated at the end of the front row, leaned forward, hands folded, his tie just slightly off-center in a way that made him seem unexpectedly human. We're moving forward with funding for the Guardian framework, he said. His voice was quiet, but carried. Effective immediately. A beat. Then murmurs again, pen scratching, a few stiff nods exchanged. And just like that, something real had shifted. Not in a headline-grabbing, scandal-fueled way, but in the quiet machinery of policy that would start protecting soldiers before they ever realized they needed it. As people began to rise, gathering their files and muttering to assistants, I stood for a moment longer at the podium. My palms felt oddly warm. I thought of my mother's house back in Savannah, the hydrangeas clipped too perfectly along the walk, Margaret herself probably sitting with her afternoon tea, never imagining how her choices had pushed me to this precise place. I wondered if she'd ever know what her silence had built in me. How every time she looked through me at her favorite daughter, she was unwittingly forging a spine strong enough to stand here and demand better for people she'd never meet. Or maybe it didn't matter. Because the families who'd need this policy wouldn't care about the ghosts that had led me here. They'd just care that finally, someone saw them. When the hall emptied, I walked slowly back toward the side door, hands brushing the fabric of my uniform trousers, feeling each seam, each weighty line of ribbon. A junior officer who couldn't have been more than 25 fell in step beside me, eyes wide. "Ma'am," he blurted, voice cracking slightly. "My brother left the service after, something like what you described." No one believed him. I wish this had existed then. I laid a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "We can't fix the past. But we sure as hell can build something better going forward." His throat worked around a grateful nod. Then he fell back, letting me continue alone down the long marble corridor. And as I pushed open the heavy door to the street outside, sunlight hit me square in the face. Warm, bright, unfiltered. I paused there for just a heartbeat, breathing it in. Because sometimes you don't realize how long you've been standing in someone else's shadow until you finally step clear. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at a tiny bistro table on a sun-soaked terrace in Lisbon, a place I'd never planned to be but somehow felt exactly right. The table was chipped tile, the kind that never sits quite level, so my coffee cup gave a little wobble whenever I rested my hand beside it. Seagulls wheeled lazily overhead, their cries mingling with the distant echo of accordion music from a street performer a block away. I'd come here with nothing but a small carry-on and the vague idea that maybe distance could help me figure out who I was without all the layers. Without the uniform, the expectations, the family history trailing behind me like an old parade float. The city had welcomed me with open windows, laundry fluttering like cheerful flags, and pastries so sweet they seemed to melt before you could chew. Most mornings, I wandered narrow cobblestone streets until my calves ached, letting my mind roam just as freely. No one here knew about the Harris family. No one recognized my face from grainy news clips about weddings gone awkward. I was simply Emma, a woman sipping her way through tiny cups of dark coffee, learning to smile without bracing for someone's judgment. Sometimes I think that's the bravest thing we ever do, show up as ourselves when there's no one left to please. One afternoon, I found myself in a tiny bookshop off Rua Augusta, dust mote swirling in golden beams from a high stained glass window. I stood for nearly an hour in the poetry aisle, fingers tracing spines, breathing in the quiet. I didn't buy a thing. It was enough to simply exist there, surrounded by stories that had nothing to do with me, or the military, or who I'd failed to become for my mother. They were just pages full of someone else's hope. On my last night in the city, I took my journal down to the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and roasted chestnuts from a vendor pushing his cart along the promenade. I settled onto a low stone bench, pen tapping against the leather cover for a minute before I finally opened it. I wrote down something I hadn't dared to put into words before. I wasn't ashamed of who I'd become. Not of the stripes I earned, the lines on my face, or the scars I sometimes traced absent-mindedly when the world grew too quiet. Those were mine. Proof I had survived, and not just combat zones, but living rooms where love was conditional and loyalty only stretched as far as comfort allowed. I used to think family was supposed to be a guarantee, a built-in shelter. Now I see it more like a garden. Sometimes it blooms beautifully, other times it strangles you if you don't keep watch. And the hardest truth might be that some gardens you simply have to walk away from, no matter how much you once tended them. I've come to believe that belonging isn't something handed to you by birthright. It's something you forge. With people who show up for your ugliest days, who stand next to you not because of old obligations but because they choose you, again and again. That realization was like a gentle door opening in my chest. It didn't erase everything that had happened, but it made room for something else. Something lighter. A breeze came off the water, ruffling the edges of my journal pages. I closed it and just sat there for a while, legs stretched out, watching the city lights ripple across the Tagus River. Nobody needed anything from me in that moment. I wasn't a general or a daughter trying to earn back a seat at someone's table. I was simply Emma, breathing in salt air, marveling at how good it felt to let the night be just a night, without history weighing it down. Before I stood to leave, I snapped a quick photo of my worn sneakers propped on the stone wall, the river beyond, the moon tangled in cables of the bridge. I posted it with a small caption, "Still here. Still me." The comments that rolled in were from soldiers I'd served with, from strangers who'd followed the news story, from quiet voices who simply wrote, "Thank you for not disappearing." Isn't that what most of us want? To be seen, entirely, flaws and all, and still be found worthy of staying. So, if you're watching this or reading my words later, wherever you might be, maybe hunched over a cracked kitchen table or sitting alone in your car because you needed 5 minutes away from expectations, I hope you hear this part clearly. You don't have to keep making yourself small so other people can stay comfortable. You get to take up space. You get to choose who you build your future with. And you get to carry your scars like the damn victories they are. I don't know exactly where I'll go after Lisbon. Maybe I'll keep drifting for a while, learning to let new places reshape the edges of old wounds. Maybe I'll plant roots somewhere no one expects. Either way, it'll be my choice, for the first time in a long time. And if this story meant something to you, even just a sliver of it, tell me down in the comments. Tell me if you've ever had to rebuild who you were outside of someone else's shadow. Or hit that like and subscribe so we can keep carving out a corner of the world that honors how messy and brave it is to be fully human. Because the story isn't really over. Not mine, not yours. And that's the best part.